Professor, it's great to see you today.
Thanks for hearing me.
Professor, you teach at University of California, Berkeley, and you are an economist. You are following very carefully what is happening globally, including what's happening today in Russia and with its economy. I wanted to ask you about that because some people recently have said that Russia's economy is doing just fine. Neil Ferguson, in fact, recently said that the Russian economy is able to support this war effort. And those who believe that Russia is having serious economic problems or that it might face economic collapse are deluding themselves. Would you agree with his assessment?
I would disagree with this assessment, and we can have debates about the validity of Russian economic data and many other aspects of the Russian economy. But one way to think about the health of the Russian economy is to think about this as a giant factory that produces various things, tanks, cars, you name it. Think about this as we have the giant factory, and then we have inputs of production. It's going to be capital, labor, it is going to be productivity. And you look at the behavior of each of these inputs, and you very quickly realize that these inputs are not really growing. Right? You look at the capital. Do you see an investment boom in Russia? I don't see any indication that investment into Russia is growing at some big rate. You look at labor input, you see people with high human capital leaving the country. We see many people are dying in Ukraine. We see the population that is aging. So it's really hard to imagine that this labor input, is growing. Productivity is the same story. There is very little innovation. New investment is not flowing into Russia. Russia was mostly copying technological advances done in other countries. It's not Silicon Valley of any kind. So you look at these three components, productivity is not growing, very likely to be shrinking going forward. Labor input, same idea, it is shrinking. Capital may be relatively stable, but it's probably misallocated because instead of flowing into productive uses, it is going into industrial military complex, and that's a not product. It's not a productive use of capital. And it's true, maybe tomorrow the Russian economy is not going to implode, but as Hemingway once said, bankruptcy starts very, very slowly and then it goes very, very fast. So, today maybe not, but in a 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, this can happen.
That's really interesting, Professor. But when we look at what's really happening inside of Russia, there's a lot of conflicting reports, and there's things that don't seem to really make sense. For instance, the inflation rate year over year is about 8.1%, according to the Russian central bank. At the same time, the central bank's key interest rate is 17%. Why are those so out of step? Why is it that, in fact, the key interest rate is more than two times higher than the inflation rate?
Indeed, this is very puzzling, but this is conditional on us taking the official statistic at face value. So, indeed, if inflation rate is 8% and the interest rate is 17%, it means the real interest rate, that is the difference between the interest rate, the nominal interest rate 17, and inflation rate 8, is going to be roughly 10 percentage points. This real interest rate 10% is very, very restrictive for the economy. And again, just to give you a sense of how restrictive it is, if you have a negative real rate, it means you really accelerate the economy. You help economy grow very fast. If this real interest rate is about maybe 2, 3 percentage points, it means you're in a neutral position. You don't help the economy, but you also don't decelerate the economy. If you have 10, it means you use every possible tool in your disposal to slow down economy radically. And why would you do this? Well, because by slowing down the economy, you hope it's going to cool down inflationary pressures in the economy. So 10% real interest rate, it is extremely contractionary. We have not seen this anywhere in a long, long time, at least in advanced economies. Why would the central bank of Russia want to do such a huge contractionary interest rate? It's hard to rationalize. However, if government officials in the central bank of Russia believe that the true rate of inflation is higher, it's not 8%, maybe it's 15%, or maybe it's higher, then it makes total sense for them to keep this nominal interest rate at this elevated level. So probably there is you ask me, where we are on the spectrum, right? Is Central Bank of Russia is really trying to kill the economy? I don't think it's their objective. The objective is to really address the inflation problem because the current rate of inflation, close to 10%, it's not good. It's very hard to control. It's very easy to slip into higher rates of inflation, potentially even hyperinflation. So that's why they are throwing everything they have in their disposal to kill this inflation problem as quickly as possible. But more realistically, as I said, the situation here is that the actual rate of inflation, the genuine number, is much higher. This is why the nominal interest rate is so high.
That's very interesting. But a lot of the economic indicators coming out of Russia lead people to think that things are doing just fine. For instance, the unemployment rate officially as of July of this year is 2.2%. And some people point to that as evidence of the fact their economy is huge. There's lots of work and everyone's been employed. It's been actually a labor shortage at this point. How should we interpret that sort of data?
Yes, it's a great question. If you have a shortage of labor, it means wages are not at some equilibrium level, right? Labor is too cheap. Firms are trying to get as much labor as they can at this low prices. And one indication here is that true, inflation is high. This is overheating the labor market. But on the other hand, we know from other sources that many, many Russians, roughly half of the population, want to have a second job. How can you reconcile these two things? One possibility here is to say, well, if you work in your normal job, your official job, your opportunities to raise your nominal wages to address inflationary sense in the economy, the loss of purchasing power, these opportunities are very limited. What you can do is to try to find a different job or try to find a second job. So the fact that half of the Russians are looking for the second job is telling me that even though their economy appears very, very overheated, people feel that their purchasing power is shrinking. And this is, again, this is another indication of inflation.
Some sources today indicate that Russia is prepared to spend about 6.3% of GDP on its defense, on its military, on its offensive war in Ukraine. That seems like a lot of money, especially considering the fact that today Russia is having more and more shortages. The Russian economy seems to be very tied to oil and gas. Their national budget that really depends on it. But today, they're losing their ability to export it. There's less demand for it. It's getting cheaper as they're giving more discounts to other countries, such as India and China, that buy it. And now it's becoming very hard, given that they projected $72 per barrel in order to balance their national budget to make ends meet. But the demands for the military, they keep going up. We've seen in the past few months, back in December 2024, they projected they'd have a $15 billion deficit. But by July, it was already about $45 billion. Now, as of September this month, it's already $54 billion deficit. And that's what we see. We don't know where they're also taking money out of the sovereign wealth fund, or they're taking out of the pension fund, or they're taking it from the banks, which today seem to be having some serious liquidity problems. What do you think?
I think this all indicates all of this indicators suggest to us that the Russian economy is facing some very difficult challenges. And just to remind everybody, economics is about budget constraints. You have limited resources and you have to make some trade-offs. You want to have a bigger war machine, it means you have to cut somewhere else. You have no free lunch there. And at this point, the Russian economy is going to feel the pinch that you can have more tanks, more soldiers, more guns, and so on. But it means you have to cut on butter. So the living standards are going to decrease. This is the situation. And you can be very creative in funding the war through various gimmicks, accounting tricks, and so on. But ultimately, the economics of this is going to catch up. There are so many resources in the Russian economy. You have to make a choice. You either make tanks, guns, or you have butter. And I think, the Russian economy is gradually moving towards more and more tanks versus butter. So it means Russians are going to suffer.
So, in the long term, it doesn't seem that this is sustainable. They keep spending money on things that they can't really afford. And for that matter, we've already seen that they cannot afford a lot of things. Meanwhile, the visible signs that there is scarcity within Russia are spreading, including in things such as gasoline. There's less fuel. We see that there's, in fact, gas lines even in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. So, it's not limited just to Siberia or to an off region which nobody's going to notice. Even the capital, the center of production, where most of the economy of Russia is located, just in the western part of the country, there's now these massive lines at gas stations. Overall, it would seem to me that that means they're really out of solutions. They don't have a lot of other options if already they're forcing the capital to begin suffering. What do you think? How do you see the situation?
I see the situation of a growing crisis, and there is really no solution in the Russian economy how to address this crisis. And the trade-off here is, in some sense, very simple. The economics is still telling us that if you have a deficit of something, you have to allow prices to adjust. Price of gasoline has to increase. However, you can't do this if you're the Russian government because it's going to create basically a panic in the Russian society that inflation is out of control. We can't afford this, we can't afford that. It can exacerbate the crisis because people will try to buy even more gasoline now while it's available and relatively cheap, which is going to put even more pressure on existing stocks and supplies. So in a way, this is kind of a snowball. You don't want this to start happening, but it is already happening. And this sense of panic is going to continue to grow because, as I said, the Russian government is not able, not willing to allow prices to adjust. And so we'll have more shortages.
It strikes me that some economists in Russia do understand what's going on. Elvira Nabulina, who's the head of the central bank, seems to be a very intelligent woman who understands very well that there are significant problems within the country. We see the finance minister making statements that indicate that he sees a lot of economic trouble ahead. Reshnikov, who's the Minister of Economics, has also indicated that at this point, Russia is entering into a recession. When we look at all this, how is it possible that the Kremlin is continuing down this track, that it's continuing to spend such incredible sums on a war that they clearly cannot afford? And as this worsens, what signs should we look for? What should we look for to see that, in fact, the situation in Russia is becoming more grave economically?
Well, ideally in economics, what we try to achieve is maximize some notion of social welfare, right? So this war obviously is not about them, about maximizing social welfare. It's not about an average Russian or average, person in the Russian economy. The objectives are very different. And so in this sense, it doesn't matter what Nabiulina and others are saying. If the objective is to capture Ukraine at any cost, then it doesn't matter what's the economic price for that. However, it's clear that Russia has made very few gains over the last 3 years. And so this war of attrition, if it continues, it's going to put more and more burden on the Russian economy. And economics laws are, maybe not exactly like laws of physics, but you can't deny gravity for a long time. At some point, gravity is going to win and you're going to collapse. The same is going to be true with the economy. You can try to deny, that we have growing problems, growing shortages, a possibility of a crisis, payment problems, but eventually these things are going to catch up and you will have a crisis.
That's very interesting, Professor. Now, within Russia itself, though, the government says that their economy is doing great. Just look at all this spending on this war. And they cite things such as production. They've got entire factories, of course, where they spend millions upon millions of dollars to make things like tanks. However, is that true? Is that the way this works? Or do tanks, which then go out the doors of the factory and into Ukraine and get destroyed, not contribute to the economy the same way that, say, a car manufacturing plant would contribute to an economy?
That's exactly true. It's one of those curious facts in economic accounting where you produce something, you don't really care if it's going to be useful or not in terms of accounting. But obviously, for the long term prospects of an economy, it makes a lot of difference if you produce a tank or a car. So basically, imagine, I drill a hole, fill it with concrete. Is this a part of GDP? The answer is yes. It doesn't matter if it makes sense to have that hole or not. The same is with tanks. You waste your resources, technically, you create value, but it's not really the value we care about.
So overall, Russia is spending money, but it's not getting a lot of bang for its buck. It's not really contributing to long-term development of the economy. Would that be true?
Yes.
So looking ahead, Russia though is looking like it's having more and more problems, and we're seeing the signs of that. We're seeing the signs that it's beginning to crack up. What sort of signs should we look for in the coming weeks or months that in fact the economy of Russia has reached a critical stage? What would that look like?
It will look like a massive panic and widespread shortages. This is when we know the economy is not doing very well. And what is happening with gas stations is one example of how this can look like, but it can be on a bigger proportion. What was happening in Russia in the first days after the invasion, when they had their run on banks and currency, that is another indication. They were lucky enough to kind of put out the fires early uh, in 2022, but they don't have resources to do this again. So it would be very hard to contain panics at this stage.
Well, we can always hope that the Russian economy begins to burn even sooner. Professor, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.